All right, so 2 years ago, the tourist town of Knysna was ablaze, the fire nearly affecting the whole town. A report released through a collaboration between insurance company Santam, the CSIR and others says the Knysna fires caused more than 3 billion rand in damages. 7 lives were lost, more than 1,000 homes and nearly 20,000 hectares of land was destroyed. So what lessons can be learned? To discuss, we're joined by Dr Guy Preston, who is the Deputy Director General, Department of Environment, Fisheries and Forestry, from our studio in Sea Point. Thank you, Doctor, for being with us. Firstly, this figure of 3.2 billion, and that's over and above lives lost. Were you surprised at the price tag?
Well, it's one of the, good evening first of all, it's one of the worst fires that we've had in our country. So no, I'm not really surprised at the level of the damage that was caused in that fire. We have seen that in forestry plantations, similar sorts of figures when wildfires really get destructive.
Yeah. Looking at the cause, so a lightning strike, drought conditions, dry and windy conditions. This sounds completely unavoidable. I mean, how much can be learned from that perfect storm that happened?
Well, it's certainly true that the winds were extremely strong. The humidity levels were unfavorable. The drought conditions that had led to it, so the veld was very flammable. And so a firestorm might have been inevitable that you had, but the level of damage that was caused was certainly avoidable to a degree. I think there were people, families, 1,000 houses burnt down, almost 1,000 and another 100 odd that were partially damaged. And a lot of those people were just incredibly unlucky that you had spotting embers that were blown by this very strong wind that happened to land in an unfavorable place for them, and their houses burnt down. But many of the houses that burnt down should not have burnt down. So
let me stop you there. Why did the houses burn down?
Well, in the case of some of the houses that burnt down, you had vegetation around the houses, particularly invasive alien plants, that burned with a far greater intensity than the indigenous species, and so that caused many of the houses that did burn down to burn, but also just other vegetation that was too close to the houses, what are called fire ladders, so where the fire finds a way of creeping up the walls and into the eaves. The eaves are a very big weakness in many designs of houses, where fire can get in and burn down houses.
Yeah. So
if precautions had been taken, and maybe I could say to the viewers that they could just go to workingonfire.org on the web and contact us, and we can give anyone the suite of precautions that you should take to try to fireproof your house.
Which
so a lot
of
those houses...
I see the report says 74% of homes that were destroyed had that vegetation right up to them. So it makes a real difference if you've got indigenous plants and a bit away from your structure.
That's correct. Yeah, that's a hugely important one. If I gave an example, in January 2000 there were big fires on Table Mountain and 80 structures were burnt down. Every single one of those structures was surrounded by invasive alien plants. Our next big fire on Table Mountain was in March of 2015. In the intervening years, Working for Water had done a massive clearing of the invasive plants. So only 8 houses were burnt in that next big firestorm. Yeah. 7 of those had invasive alien plants around them. So it's a fairly obvious thing that we need to do, is to try to control the invasives. Unfortunately, though, we have a situation where most of these species use fire for germination. The acacias, the wattles, that is, the gums, the pines, and other species. So after you've had a fire, if you go and look at Knysna now, there's a carpet of billions of trees that are coming up, invasive trees. And every fire, we tend to say, is a precursor for a worse fire in years to come, unless we do something to control the fires.
So you've touched on government's responsibility then. Is this a priority in veld lands, in open areas, getting rid of those trees?
Yes, we have the Working for Water program that was started in 1995. We have cleared 3.3 million hectares of land of invasive species. We also have the Working on Fire program, a sibling program with over 5,000 highly trained firefighters with aerial support that is part of the government's response to try to deal with this. But the responsibility is not just government's, it's everyone's responsibility. There are very strong laws through the National Veld and Forest Fire Act which compel people to take precautions. And in many cases, these precautions were not taken. If people were to take those precautions, join the fire protection associations, fireproof their houses and be ready for these things, a lot of the situation that we've had would not have occurred.
Yeah.
But I think also I would mention, if I may, that we have been spending the past 2 years developing fireproofing of houses to a level that probably hasn't been done in the world before. And we're hoping that President Ramaphosa and Minister Creasy will launch this in the near future as a major step towards trying to prevent the kind of fires that we've experienced there.
And looking at this, some people are saying these are relatively rich people's homes. Imagine fires and the damage they can do when you've got these very informal structures, although I don't know if you have that vegetation. What was the insurance situation? Were most people covered in this instance?
No, a lot of people were not covered. It certainly wasn't just rich people. It was a spectrum of people in terms of levels of affluence, and so the damage did spread informal settlements, RDP structures, through to very fancy formal houses. It was just indiscriminate. Like I said in the beginning, I think some people were just incredibly unlucky that the flames ended up where they did.
Yeah.
But still, the argument is what we're wanting to do is be prepared to do these things. You know, it starts with our catchments. So if we manage our catchments, our mountains, with the invasive species, we're going to get far more water. So it's a key long-term factor for water security in the country, is to ensure that we control these invasive species. But they also then have the problem that they burn at 10 times the intensity of the indigenous species that they displace, and further they cause erosion, mudslides and so on, as negative impacts aside from the loss of biological diversity. So if we start with that area, we do our block burns so that we don't have massive areas that are burnt all in one go. The fire that happened last year in George had 95,000 hectares. And maybe something to mention there, our acting minister at the time, Derek Hanekom, flew over the area, and one of the things that he commented on was how the indigenous vegetation, what's called Afro-montane forests, the Knysna forests and so on, how that held the fires. The fires did not burn in the forests, the indigenous forests, but they did ravage the plantations and the invaded areas, and indeed fynbos areas, but fynbos is born to burn, it's meant to burn. So if I can answer your question finally, in terms of the insurance, I think the insurance industry has got a lot to learn and a lot to change and do in the way in which it's looking at the role that wildfires have. With climate change, we know that things are going to get worse. Invasions are an incredibly difficult thing to get on top of, given the scale of the levels that we have in our country. So we are going to have continued fires, and the insurance industry must help us to ensure that people, when they build houses, don't build them in the wrong places in the first place. So if you're going to build your house at the top of a hill with a nice view, overlooking an area, fire will sweep up that hill, and you're far more vulnerable. If you use the right materials, the sort of materials that we're going to talk about, hopefully with the President and our Minister, you would not have that risk of your house burning down.
Yeah.
And then the vegetation that you've mentioned.
So this is sad, thinking that homes could have been saved. But thank you. Looking at the lessons, and maybe insurance companies in future will incentivize us to fireproof our homes, but indigenous plants much better than weeds. He says Environmental Affairs can provide lots more information. Thank you very much, Dr. Guy Preston, the Deputy Director General, Department of Environment, Fisheries and Forestry.